is Jenny Gibson. I'm Professor of Neurodiversity and Developmental Psychology here in Peddle. And one of the things that I focus on in my research is early language development and its influences and how we can support young children with their language development. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Prof, who is running a fantastic programme with City of York Council called Early Talk for York, and that's focused on really understanding how we can support children's language development from the earliest days in a very place-based way. So the idea of these workshops is that we do a very fast 15-minute research talk, followed by a very fast 15-minute sharing of a practice example that kind of complements the research that we're doing. And I'm really pleased that Rob could join us today because I think it's one of the most exciting things that's in practice in the UK at the moment, thinking about children's early language development. So we're going to do some reflecting together on this. Okay. Just wait for the last few stragglers to come in. Okay, so these are our shared aims for today. We're going to reflect together on the importance of a rich understanding of context in research and practice aimed at understanding and improving language development in young children. And we want to illustrate how contextual factors linked to early language development can be addressed in both research and in practice. And then you're going to do some activities. Oh. Come in. Fantasy. Okay, so you're in for a treat. We're going to do two 15-minute talks, one based on research. I'm going to do one based on practice that Rob's going to do. And we're going to ask in my talk what we can learn from large cohort data sets about how language development is influenced by societal and family factors, and what's the impact on academic outcomes. Rob is then going to come in with his talk about Early Talk for York, which is a citywide, evidence-informed approach to improving speech, language and communication development in children aged 0 to 5 years. Then we're going to throw it open to you. We've got some questions for reflection and discussion that we'll present. So to start off with, let's think about context on language development from a research perspective. And the different contexts that I've thought about in my research. So first of all, we're thinking about language development, so thinking about that language environment and what it means. And it seems like a really obvious thing to say, but the experience of spoken language is crucial for learning that language. And the frequency with which we hear different sounds and sound combinations in our language, or indeed languages if we're multilingual, make up those words and phrases and those grammatically correct inputs that you get from hearing and engaging in conversation is the very basis of our language learning. And there are large individual differences in the amounts of language that babies and young children hear. So just to give a research example from another study, in middle-class families, toddlers hear between 5,000 to 7,000 utterances a day. Around a third of these are questions, and more than half begin with the same construction. Look at this. Are you that? Here's this, that kind of thing. So toddlers have that experience of repetition from their linguistic inputs. And if you've done much research or sort of been in the sector for a while, you've probably heard of Hart and Risley's famous study from 1995, where they looked at the number of utterances that young children were exposed to based on their socio-economic status. And higher income families, children were hearing around 487 utterances per hour, compared to low income families who were on benefits in the USA were hearing around 178 per hour. And by the end of the study range, right, you can kind of extrapolate that by 4 years of age, there's this millions of differences in terms of the language input that children have had, children are exposed to. And of course that relationship between input and output, so we think of output as the child's language development, is quite striking, so it does matter. But probably less discussed is that Hart and Risley's findings also suggest that quality of language environment matters too, and that's really the research direction that's going at the moment. And many studies are now confirming that quality is just as important as quantity, perhaps even more important than quantity. I don't have time to go through all that research evidence today, but that quality of the environment is really where we are focusing. So we're thinking about that context of a high quality language learning environment. Sue Ralston and others have come up with this concept of the early language and communication environment. And it's got kind of different components. You can think about context. So what parents do with their child to promote communication skills. So pretend play. I put mother-child interactions there. Really that's often because the people who are taking part in large cohort studies are mothers, but it doesn't have to be a particular gender. It's about a significant caregiver who's interacting and providing that stimulation for a child. And then critically, and I think this speaks a little bit sort of building on the work that we heard about this morning, what parents do with the resources that they do have. Now, you can use kind of books in the home as a very crude indicator of how well children might do with kind of later language development, but a much more subtle and more effective indicator is how often those books are read and shared and enjoyed as a family and the vocabulary is picked out. The other aspect of context that's important to this early language and communication environment is, of course, poverty, and that was something, again, picked upon in our conversations earlier. So thinking about this socio-economic context for child development and the impact on language learning. So these are data from Speech and Language UK that suggests that, that in some areas of deprivation in the UK, more than 50% of children start school with speech, language and communication needs. And indeed, for some deprived areas post-pandemic, post-lockdowns, those figures are actually creeping up in line with the data that Louise presented earlier. And really, those pervasive effects of poverty, we also saw this kind of family stress model, but really being worried about money, having to go out to multiple jobs increases the economic pressures on families and reduces the time that they have to spend in these high quality interactions. I'm not going to talk about that because we're running late. So I wanted to present just an overview of a research study looking at academic outcomes associated with these early language development contexts. So we're thinking about this connection between the early language and communication environment and children's later reading and writing outcomes. So there are lots of different bits of research out there. I'm just going to tell you about one study that we did with the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children data to understand pathways from early life experiences to psychosocial and literacy outcomes in Key Stage 1. And the questions we asked were, what are the effects of the early language and communication environments on linguistic and social development in early middle childhood? And in turn, what are the effects of early language and social development on psychosocial and literacy outcomes in late middle childhood? And then we wanted to understand whether there might be protective effects of that early language and communication environment. So we did a secondary data analysis using this large cohort data set. If you don't know this, sometimes it's called Children of the 90s, and they collected a bunch of children and families, collected data on them and followed them. In fact, they're still following them from the 90s until now. And there are over 15,000 children in this data set. And it's a combination of parent-reported measures, self-report questionnaires as children got older and can kind of report on their own experiences, and there are some direct measures of children's development and outcomes in there too. And this secondary data analysis of a large cohort study is really exciting because you can sort of travel in time with this sort of thing. You can pick out children with characteristics at one age and then look back and say, what was going on in the early years for children who are doing well here? What might go on a bit later for children who've got a current profile that indicates difficulties. So I'm going to just talk today about the literacy outcomes we looked at. We also looked at some of the SDQ data, looking at psychological outcomes. We're really interested in, this is our outcome measure here, 11 years old, Key Stage 1 literacy, by which we mean reading and writing skills. These are the other things that we had in our models. So we have the demographic factors, family income, family occupation. We have our measure of the home language, early language and communication environment. I can talk more about what went into that measure, but it was essentially parents reporting on those things. What do they do with their child? Do they sing with their child? Are they engaging around language, around books, so kind of building that sophisticated communication environment? We've got a measure of school readiness at the start of school that kind of splits into academic school readiness, the sort of reading, writing, counting sort of school readiness, and also the social and emotional part of school readiness. And then at the 7 to 9 years age, we've got some measures of friendships and play, so children's social development, their pragmatics, can they use language in a conversational context? Also their decoding skills, so that's the kind of, can they literally decode which letter corresponds to which sound when they're reading, and structural language, which is their grammar and vocabulary. Now I'm going to prepare you for the next slide because it's really messy, but don't worry, we're going to break it down. So when we build these sorts of longitudinal models, we have these horrible spaghetti diagrams. The way to read it is we've got our measures in the study. So starting here, that's our 2-year-old starting point with the early language and communication environment. And as we go through the child's developmental time, we're coming to their outcome at age 11 years. And the main measures in the study you can see in the ovals. And I've just put below the line the things that we considered as controls in this particular study. And I'm going to take them out for simplicity's sake when I'm presenting the results in a second. So let's break it down a little bit. So we have our measure of home learning, home language and communication environments at time 1 in our study. And these arrows show the things where we could trace a direct impact. So what parents were doing in terms of building language and communication skills in that early years period had a direct impact on children's measures of literacy for school readiness, as well as their social school readiness. And even moving into the age 7 to 9 years, we're still seeing those direct impacts of language development and social development when children are a bit older. So that what happens in the home, that real family context for learning language, carries direct impact later on. But what we're not seeing here is a direct outcome in our Key Stage 2 literacy. So that's the end of school literacy assessment for children in England. So this kind of builds up the next part of the model. So we've got our top pathway here. And what we're seeing is the early language and communication environment is affecting literacy at school entry, so those early school readiness measures, which is impacting language development at age 7, which in turn impacts on Key Stage 2 literacy. So what you've got is a sort of developmental chain effect. And I think that's exciting for reasons that we'll come back to. The bottom pathway is about the social development, and again you can see that that early language and communication skill that's in the family is also impacting children's social development as well as their more academic school readiness and sort of classical traditional educational measures. So you're seeing an impact on their social development, their friendships, and so on. And again, we're seeing this indirect effect on key stage 2 outcomes. So you've got a dual approach here. So we often talk about sort of traditional approaches to academic development being contrasted with social, and which one should it be? We're seeing here evidence that they both really matter in young children's development. The final thing I'm going to add to this diagram is the impact of poverty in our model. And, you know, when we're thinking about direct effects that we didn't quite see for the home language and communication environment, there's direct and pervasive impacts across the whole system. So in conclusion, we can see that the effects of poverty are pervasive, and family income and social circumstances directly influence that language development piece. But we also see evidence here that a good language and communication environment does make a difference. The effect of that language and communication impact on final school outcomes as measured here is indirect, and I think this is showing us that development is a dynamic, progressive and interactive way of being. It's not a single fixed path, and multiple inputs are important. So that is my take-home message here. I'm going to hand over to Rob to talk us through a practice example linked to this topic. So thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Jenny. Really interesting stuff. Got lots of questions for you already. I'll catch you later. Afternoon, everyone. Really great to be here with you. My name is Rob Newton. I'm the local evidence lead at City of York Council and also the Associate Strategic Director at Huntington Research School in York. You'll have to forgive me. I'm going to use a script this afternoon because I have a danger of talking about Early Talk for York for far too long. It's my black chair subject for Mastermind in the future. So I'm going to, in order to stick to time, I'm going to kind of stick to script. So what I want you to consider as I'm talking for the next 10-15 minutes is the importance of context in the pursuit of improving children's outcomes, specifically in this case speech-language communication outcomes. So Early Talk for York is an evidence-based, place-based approach to improving children's speech-language communication outcomes by the time that they're 5. We started off as a project, but we've deliberately moved away from that language as we work towards embedding a consistent offer for our children in our city. In York, as in many places, we've got a long track record of project tourism, and specifically so in the early years sector. And the reasons for that have been entirely understandable, but our analysis is that these short-term piecemeal approaches are a core part of the reason why outcomes have not improved in the way that we might hope. On the subject of outcomes, it's really important for us to set the context of York in these terms, as many people have preconceived ideas about York as a city of affluence and a picturesque tourist destination. Some of those preconceptions have got a certain amount of substance, but what they hide is a story of stark inequalities in our city. Outcomes for children are excellent across all phases, except if you're experiencing some amount of disadvantage, in which outcomes are really poor. That starts at age 5, and in 2017, we had the largest outcome gap out of any local authority area in the country. I think that data that Louise shared this morning, plotting those local authorities, actually kind of helped tell that story a little bit more. So since 2018, we've been working on the design, development, implementation and scale-up of Early Talk for York. And at the centre of this has been the messaging around why we are focusing on children's speech-language communication outcomes. So research evidence tells us that these outcomes are hugely important, as Jenny's just been talking about, around longer term outcomes. So whilst the work may have some positive benefits for specific aspects of the complex early years system, such as reducing waiting lists or helping particular teams tackle particular challenges, it's the emphasis on children and their outcomes that really unite us, and we take every opportunity to come back to that message and remind ourselves of what it is that we're collaborating on and why. We also describe Early Talk for York as being an evidence-informed approach, and I sometimes wonder whether there's a more often used phrase in some circles at the moment. So we're evidence-informed, but what is it that we mean by being evidence-informed? This work by Foundations, previously the EIF, is the best graphic that I've come across that aligns with what we mean by being evidence-informed in our work. So this is the evidence pie. It highlights the importance of scientific research and evaluations of interventions together as research findings, but alongside evidence on local context, encompassing professional knowledge, lived experience, population data and organisational data together as local data. So when we combine all of the elements of this, I believe that we're being truly evidence-informed. If you're interested in more on this, I think Becky Saunders from Foundations is talking a little bit more about the work that they're doing to amplify this way of thinking in a workshop a little bit later on this afternoon. So as we've developed Early Talk for York, we've started out from a position of wanting to be strengths-based. So what's already happening in our local area that aligns with the research evidence and also appears to be impactful and feasible. Then, how do we cause these things to happen more widely, with greater consistency and with greater focus? We didn't want to be the next new shiny thing, but instead amplify the success of what was already happening and working well locally. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time going through each specific aspect of the package that forms Early Talk for York. If you want to learn more, there's a link to the web page there where you'll find our roadmap. But in brief, what we do, we train teams of professionals really well, so we don't rely on specific individuals and hoping that that will somehow cause change around them, which again our analysis suggests is a key point of failure on previous attempts to improve outcomes. We also check children's development on a regular basis, responding to the well-documented issue of under-identification of need. We facilitate frequent contact between the specialist and universal workforce to empower greater early intervention, and we develop relationships around all of those around the child to enhance the support available to them. As we started really small, we were able to test and learn about our choices and amend them. A good example of this is the screening element of our programme. We started off by offering the screening tool to practitioners to use as they felt best. The recommendation of annual universal screening that is now being followed in 95% of schools and settings in York came from the practitioners themselves and the strong peer advocacy for this to continue across the city. I can't stand here and say for certain today. However, I suspect that if we'd mandated universal screening and all its workload implications as an expectation from the start of the intervention, we might have received a very different response. So from an initial group of 12 schools and settings and a small representative group of other teams, Early Talk for York is now happening to some extent in the vast majority of York's schools and settings across whole teams of other services and serving around 4,000 plus children each year. Just to talk a little bit about our own evaluation. So our evaluation of our approach has been really important to us throughout, not to conclusively determine the impact of our approach, but in order that we can continue to learn and develop as we go through. One mistake that we think we've made in the past is not to pay sufficient attention to our evaluative approaches, and we've attempted to do better on that from the outset with our work on Early Talk for York, with a clear theory of change and associated evaluation schedule. We know that Early Talk for York has a good impact on practitioner knowledge, skill and confidence in relation to speech-language communication, the universal provision, the identification and the intervention. We're seeing growing numbers of children make faster progress in the development of these foundational skills, including some with the highest levels of need, with children being removed from specialist waiting lists as a result of the enhanced support that they're receiving. Our main outcome measure has been the communication language domains of the early years foundation stage profile. As the approach has grown across the city, it's become more challenging to disentangle the impact of Early Talk for York from other things, not least the varying impact of COVID that we see across all of our contexts. However, where we have been able to track progress in the places where the approach is most embedded, we've seen two things. Firstly, better outcomes in these domains now than pre-pandemic, and secondly, a significant reduction in the gap between children experiencing disadvantage and their peers. Continuing on the theme of evaluation, we've also seen some positive improvements that we perhaps weren't necessarily expecting or planning for from the outset. So because we've now got health visitors and early childhood education and care staff working more closely together on this, it's facilitated greater opportunities to develop an approach to the integrated 2-year review in York, something we'd never previously been able to get off the ground. Our specialist speech and language services have now opened a request for helpline, which allows concerned others, professionals or family members, to get direct advice and support from a speech and language therapist. We've expanded a previous Students in Schools programme from the University of York to include early years settings, with around 50 volunteers per term providing additional capacity to Early Talk for York. And in partnership with our libraries and the NSPCC, we now have a series of stay and play sessions for families with 0 to 2s running across the city. And the focus of those sessions build on Look, Say, Sing, Play, which some of you might be familiar with, draws on the work that we heard about this morning in terms of the Oxford brain story. So maybe some of those things would have happened without Early Talk for York, but it's really easy to identify how the approach has played a key role in enabling those to do so successfully. We're still grappling with how we best support parents in their knowledge and understanding of children's development. We've made some progress in this area, but we've definitely still got more to do. In terms of independent evaluation, we've now been fortunate enough to have our screening programme evaluated by Dr. Erin Dysart, now of University of Leeds, which you can read on our webpage if you're interested, and we're in the process of seeking opportunities to have the full approach independently evaluated also. So, as a wrap up, just to return to that question that I posed at the beginning, which is how important is context in the pursuit of improving children's outcomes? So, firstly, from an evaluative perspective, I feel like the education community has been busy patting itself on the back for increasing the quantity and quality of evaluation of interventions available to us, and I think that's a really positive mood. Whilst doing so, there's been a narrative about following in the footsteps of colleagues working in health who, by some measures, have been more robustly scientifically informed for some time. However, at the same time that education research has been making this progress, the medical world has been developing its focus on more nuanced evaluation work, thinking beyond the testing of individual and isolated interventions and recognising the importance of context in delivering better health outcomes across the population. So work by Public Health England recognises that whilst interventions in whatever form may play a part in improving outcomes for a population, the interdependencies with local context, be that in services available, employment prospects, social networks, built in natural environment, etc., are all also hugely important. A key point to the example that I've shared with you today is that improving these outcomes has not been the work of just one sector, but of a collaboration across domains and specialisms. We know that one of the challenges of being more research evidence informed is that the push to adopt manualised programmes that have been rigorously evaluated through experimental design can be extremely challenging as they need to fit into complex local systems. If you're interested in more, I'd signpost you to the piece that myself and others wrote in the TES earlier this year. And finally, from a kind of more practical place-based approach, through our experiences of developing Early Talk for York, we wouldn't recommend another local area attempting to replicate exactly what we're doing. Our approach has been intrinsically place-centric, and that's paying some rewards in the outcomes that we're seeing in improved practices and outcomes for children. We've learnt a lot, and we believe that there's a lot of our learning that may be useful for other local areas to consider when developing their own approaches. So, for example, we've identified 6 active ingredients, and Paul started the day talking about active ingredients as a potential opportunity for us to think about. We believe are really essential components of our approach. And if other local areas are interested in developing their own approaches, we'd recommend considering these as part of their thinking. Last bit from me, I promise. Early Talk for York generally considered a success story. However, it's not a panacea, and we continue to work hard on ensuring that it works in our local context. And so whilst I back other local areas to be able to develop similar models based upon our experience, I think if we're really serious about changing outcomes for large groups of children, I think we need to move away from looking for the silver bullet and the obsession with working at scale, and instead build capacity in local areas to support high quality leadership and implementation that's responsive to context. Thank you.